You're listening to the Yeshiva of Newark at IDT podcast. I'm your host and curator, Rabbi Abram Kibalevich, and I hope you enjoy this episode. You've bought your tickets. The ushers are about to open the doors. Yes, the Projectionist has Semicha is about to start. But first, if you own a retail business and accept credit cards, your customers are getting points, miles, and all sorts of rewards every time they use their card. And you're paying the price. That's why NRS Pay, a product of National Retail Solutions, a division of the IDT Corporation, offers its cash discount program FeeBuster. You can start accepting credit cards for free. If your business processes over $18,000 a month, you pay no monthly fee and $0 out of your pocket for transaction. This means you, as a retailer, can enjoy the benefits of accepting plastic, and your customers still get those crucial miles they crave and need. NRS Pay FeeBuster provides every client with a free credit card reader with no long-term contract, no early termination fee, cancel anytime without a penalty. I'm personally familiar with this company, and they truly stand by their product, and they'll help you with live, stateside-based customer service on any issue or question. Visit nrspay.com or call 833-289-2767 to learn more about NRS Pay and the fantastically fair FeeBuster. Clear the aisles, the Projectionist has Semicha. I'm here, as usual, with Yitzchak Kolakowski. Yitzchak, you brought up the point to me that so many television sitcoms were, in a way, based on films. I know one of your favorites, which you've talked about here on this platform, The Many Loves of Dobie Gillis, was actually based on a film, a movie. I'm not sure if Dwayne Hickman was the star. That possibly was. But at that time, television in the mid 50s, late 50s, 60s was looking for a hook to sort of make their sitcom work. And if you could take a popular film, why not?
MASH was a movie first before it was a TV show, right?
Right. So MASH was very similar. All you need to do is, replicate that. Now, of course, part of what they did, the producers and writers of MASH, in a way, blunted much of the sort of like very satirical and really pushing the envelope type of jokes. It was an R-rated film.
Right.
So, they had to, in a way, sort of like, give in to some of the sensuousness and implications and double entendres, but they were able to get away with it by toning it down. Again, when it's a sort of a slice of life that doesn't necessarily end with the death of a character. When we take a look at, the classic films of the 30s and 40s, that where we take a certain character and we take them through their struggle and either through their happy ending or their death, it's hard to make a television series from Little Caesar, a television series out of Scarface. It'll be hard. Similar, I'll mention the movie that you love more than anything, almost like the Rabbeinu show, King Kong. It'd be hard to make a television series about King Kong. Mighty Joe Young, you could probably do it, but King Kong, you'd have a hard time. Because it ends, here's your story. We go there, we find Kong, we bring him back, and of course Kong dies. So what are you going to do? You can't have a television series where you bring him back. But there were enough films that have enough this might be a project that we can now. And of course, these television series usually, of course, cast sometimes an unknown or sometimes someone else that might sort of replicate the character on film. Sometimes they could get some of the original actors from the film, like in Dobie Gillis.
It was.
But I'm sure that they probably, were able to use some of the original cast from the film. You talk about MASH. I guess you have to add to this genre The Odd Couple. Now, The Odd Couple, of course, is based on a Neil Simon play, so it's hard to say that. But I think part of the reason why the idea sprung that we could turn this into a television series was because of the success of the Jack Lemmon, Walter Matthau film that was extremely popular. And even though the film sort of ends like the play does, with Felix moving out, there's no reason why we can't imagine a scenario where he doesn't move out of the apartment. And we start pretty much at the same place where the play/movie began, but take it to a different direction using characters that were in the play. And some of them show up, of course, in the first season of The Odd Couple. But The Odd Couple actually, in many people's minds, really gave us the best Oscar and Felix we had. Again, I think The Odd Couple was able, because it took that basic dynamic of the slob and the fuss budget and was able to work on it. Again, obviously, a show runs for 7 or 8 or 10 years like The Odd Couple or MASH. You're going to run out of ideas. MASH, of course, the ultimate inanity is that the Korean War lasts 3 years and the show is on for 12 years or whatever, how many years it is. So you have, you have Alan Alda in the beginning of playing Hawkeye, looking like an old man by the time supposedly the Korean War is over. But again, the inanity wasn't just the fact that the cast kept on changing with David Ogden Stiers and others, is that it lasted for so long. Like, how are we supposed to understand that this is happening, right? It's supposed to be based on something in the real world, but again, people still kept on coming back to it, to the point that MASH's last episode was considered the great event that everybody had to see. It seems like people should have stopped watching MASH way before that. I think we should also mention, before we get to what our main, the course is, which is, I think, going to be a lot less juicy than people expect. I think we should also mention the fact that in the 30s and 40s, there were these films that were sort of like television series, whether they were Philo Vance or Mr. Moto or Charlie Chan.
Blondie and Dagwood.
Yes, exactly. We had Dagwood, Bondi, or Torchy Blaine. Before television, they would produce these every couple of months, and you could almost have they could come out, Andy Hardy, of course. These were all, but once the world of television was able to give you a story every week or so, Hollywood shied away from this. I'm not talking about the sequels, which is a whole different discussion that we could talk about. I'm talking about these type of films where they take the same characters and they revisit them in some sort of other domestic situation. Hollywood abdicated those types of films because they realized that was going to be the province of television and television production.
And they wound up, having a new life in television, meaning that the Blondie and Dagwood film series almost was, kind of like Little Rascals or the Three Stooges, that these things were a new life on television. And
right. And that's where I know about the Mr. Moto and Charlie Chan series, because they were shown on late night TV. We've talked about on this forum about the golden age of the 1950s and the teleplays that were written by Rod Serling and others that were turned into films, sometimes more successful than the original source and sometimes not. So, there was clearly a lot of, it went both ways.
Yeah, I mean, there was, Armis Brooks started as a radio show, then went to television. And after the television run ended, they made a movie that just told the whole story of her life, right from scratch. It wasn't, when I thought of it, I thought, oh, we're gonna see all the characters already developed the way we know. No, they went through. They were assuming when they made that movie that you had no idea who these characters were, even though they'd been popular for over a decade, maybe 15 years already. That these characters were popular, and they just retold the story. And same thing, later on, all these different movies that, the Star Trek films,
then we have something else that occurred. That started in the late 70s, 80s, 90s, going even into today, where you have movies based on successful television programs. As you say, Star Trek, of course, is based on the extreme popularity of the reruns of the Star Trek original series. There was this call for creating these big films that came out, bringing back the original cast. But really, we could even, talk about other films. Harrison Ford and Tommy Lee Jones, scored a tremendous career achievement in The Fugitive, which is, of course, based on the 1960s David Janssen program. And there have been Starsky and Hutch and the Dukes of Hazzard. There's been so many, I Spy. And again, many of these films have fallen flat. Part of it is, of course, that they wanted to mine the nostalgia desire of the people who had the money to pay for these films and say, here's a film based on your favorite TV show when you were a kid. And this doesn't even deal with, Yitzchak, the TV movies that were based, the one-shot TV movies like Return to Gilligan's Island or something like that, that were based on the long running series.
There were many of those. The Return to Mayberry and the Leave It to Beaver and
So, and these were sort of like television productions. They weren't really shown in movie houses, but they were a different repackaging, trying to reimagine and put in 90 minutes or so the essence of what had been a 5, 6, or 7 or 8 year run on a program, which of course you weren't always able to do. I also mentioned in this regard, I think, a very interesting version of a television series based on a movie, and that is the Coen brothers' masterpiece Fargo, which spawned an FX series that really didn't even have any of the same characters in it, but tried to capture the same sort of strange, bizarre, eerie, frightening mood that's in Fargo and the comedic undertones, and then creating stories that were inspired by Fargo.
Yeah, the hits and the misses, like the Planet of the Apes, it only ran for, I think, 11 episodes, something like that. They tried to make I think there were almost more Planet of the Apes movies.
Yes, I think so. I think so. We speak without notes, without preparation, just from the gobbledygook and mass of total unimportant facts that are in our brains. But you, for some reason, were inspired by what I think is one of the all-time great Hollywood films, which is, of course, the 1939's Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. A television series was tried to be concocted out of Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. I was unaware of it. You knew about it. You knew about the fact that it was shown, that some of those episodes are available on YouTube, and you watched one of them, the one that features incredibly. I can't imagine Harpo Marx ever have been in the original film, but somehow Harpo Marx was in this film, and in the James Stewart character, this fresh-faced innocent who gets pushed into Washington, but there are other forces that are trying to push him around, and he has to find his voice and stand up for the great American ideal. They came up with Fess Parker as the actor.
I'll tell you, when I noticed that, I realized that at least, even though the TV show is kind of silly and it does kind of fall flat, but nonetheless, thinking of it in retrospect, Fess Parker really represents how that character is written more than how Jimmy Stewart played it. Meaning Jimmy Stewart, of course, was masterful in how he played it, but he played it as Jimmy Stewart. He didn't play it as how the character, who, as he is written, was much more of a Daniel.
In other words, Jefferson Smith in the original screenplay was meant to be a scoutmaster, a big outdoors 4-H type of guy.
Right.
Fess Parker, because of his history with Davy Crockett and the fact that he's just 6'6" from Fort Worth, Texas, meant that he was more that character than Jimmy Stewart presented himself.
That's how I feel it. Meaning Jimmy Stewart made it his own. I'm not complaining at all about Jimmy Stewart. I think what he did with the character was much better than how I don't think the film would be as memorable if Fess Parker was in the film.
Well, of course, you can't even mention them in the same breath, Yitzchak. And I'm going to talk about Fess Parker because in a couple of minutes. But obviously, Fess Parker does not have Stewart's range. There's no way Fess Parker could have ever stood up and collapsed the way Jimmy Stewart did during the filibuster. There's no way Fess Parker could have ever brought off that filibuster scene. In fact, there is this. I'll mention where Fess Parker did something similar in his Davy Crockett days. But clearly television, they weren't looking for Jimmy Stewart. Jimmy Stewart was not going to be, he didn't feel he was over the hill to the point that he needed to be in a television series. The premise, the
70s, that he had the Jimmy Stewart show.
Yes, again, by that time, somebody pushed him into it. But, having Fess Parker, and again, was setting the stage here. Fess Parker had done Davy Crockett. He was discovered by the Disney people in one of your favorite movies, Them. He played a small part in Them, where he played a police officer, a highway patrolman that is reporting about the giant ants that are that he was surrounded by. And the producers somehow were struck. People had told him, why don't you get James Arness to play
who was the star of Them,
right? Of Them, to play Davy Crockett. But they actually felt that Fess Parker, maybe they could get him for cheaper, but they actually felt that Fess Parker was someone who would actually fit the bill more. They're both big guys. They're both 6'6" or so. But there's something about Fess Parker's freshness that they felt made him the person they wanted for Davy Crockett. Now, again, what Disney was after was something completely different. Walt Disney and his genius realized television's power. The fact through Uncle Milty and others, everybody was buying televisions. What he wanted was people to get off of their couches and be able to spend the money to go to California to visit his amusement parks. And he was right. He wanted to use the type of creative imagination that went into his animated films. And he wanted to bring that to a ride, bring that to an experience. And he realized the way to do that was to constantly push the fact that this amusement park was going to be out there and it would have different areas, different themes. It was a theme park. It wasn't an amusement park. It was a theme park. It was based on a vision, and Disneyland was the land, and it had Adventureland, and it had Futureland, and it also had Frontierland. And in Frontierland, Disney felt he was going to create, he was actually going to invest the money into making color, CinemaScope, color films that, of course, they would be shown on television where nobody had color, but he would make them in color. And he would have these films in his vault, but they would be films that would be made like prestige television is today. It was not like the one held camera. It was way above anything, even like of that Lucille Ball was doing in I Love Lucy. These were on a movie scale type of television programs. He would insert them sporadically week by week into the slot that ABC gave him on Sunday nights. And over a period of 1955 and 1956, he and his producers, the director by Norman Foster, who we mentioned a number of weeks ago and Kissed the Blood Off My Hands, a protege of Orson Welles, they were able to create this very beautifully shot. I've never seen Tennessee shot as beautiful, the Davy Crockett story. And it was basically done in 3 30-minute films that were shown throughout the late fall and winter of 1955 and 1956, leading to the opening of Disney World in 1956. However, there was what Disney didn't realize, that these movies, these television movies as they were, these half-hour films were so well done, and they were able to place Fess Parker, who, again, his acting range might not have been great, but that 30-minute area within the small screen, he was perfect. And he was this American hero. He really, in a way, stood for, in the 1950s, the great frontier, that while everybody was talking politics, even the great war hero Eisenhower was getting enmeshed in the difficulties of the Cold War and the complexities of geopolitics. Here we had a story of someone who fifed on the generals, somebody who was able to cut to the chase, somebody had the good old American know-how, and it didn't hurt by the fact that he was from the South. I think for years, Southerners were portrayed in the 1920s and 30s in many of the films, some of them which I've recommended here to you, as bumpkins, as idiots, as people. They never got the accents right anyway. The only thing they knew is they were in the hills, and they had they had very little manners, and they were just people to stay away from, and they were still in a way of being shunned by the loss of the Civil War. Gone with the Wind represented, I think, in many ways, and that's why the film is so verboten today, because in a way it seems to extol the old Southern ways. But these stories didn't go back to the old South. They went back to the pre-antebellum South, and they had a Southern character aided and abetted by his best friend, played by Buddy Ebsen, who also compiled, he sang songs and told stories and was some of the person who helped create the myth of Davy Crockett. And this was a phenomenon. The Southerners loved it. The kids loved it.
Every kid had the
coonskin cap, sure. And everyone wanted the buckskin, the coonskin cap. This was, in a way, much bigger than even what Walt had planned. Yeah, it did bring people to Disneyland, but people wanted more of Davy Crockett.
I mean, I know my father was and I think every boy from his age, he was born in 1954, and he was just Davy Crockett. That was it. And the Alamo was something that,
But even though the film came out when he was a little child, remember, Disney had its platform to be able to rerun the old shows.
Right.
Disney owned the property, and they actually packaged together the 3 half-hour episodes into a movie, which you can see now on Disney Plus. And it is a beautifully shot film, as I said. And it seems like 3 episodes of TV put together, but it's still quite enjoyable to watch. You can see Buddy Ebsen dancing a little bit. Again, it doesn't really do justice to the drama of what the Alamo is about. But Fess Parker, is clearly the star from beginning to end. Whether he was working for Disney or not, Disney owned his movie, the movie that he was in, that they made for him, and they kept on showing it. And it was shown not only in the ABC iteration of the Walt Disney Show, but also when it went to NBC, which is where I saw it when I was a kid every Sunday night. And, I knew Uncle Walt as well. I was waiting for him to come talk to me and tell me about what movies were going to be coming out. And part of what they would do is, again, keep on showing Zorro and many of the other Disney creations that they had made in the 50s, that they would just keep on showing it in the 1960s. Sometimes some of their feature films, or pieces of their feature films, or half of their feature films. And this kept Davy Crockett in people's minds. So that's why it seemed like a smart idea to get Fess Parker. Now, why doesn't it work, though? That's why it's a smart idea to get Fess Parker to be in this character, this Jefferson Smith character, sort of this modern day Davy Crockett. Why doesn't it work in the television series?
I can see what they're doing. It was enjoyable. It wasn't painful to watch, but it just didn't click. The episode that I watched, the whole reason I think that it made it to YouTube was because it was some kind of a Marx Brothers archive, and like you mentioned, that Harpo was in this particular episode, although Leo Gorcey, another favorite of mine, was a guest star in another episode. So they had different guest stars every week, which also seemed to be some kind of an appeal. Again, I think Jimmy Stewart was better than the character. I think Fess Parker was perfect for this character, but that the character wasn't as great without it being Jimmy Stewart.
What would have been the drama of each half hour?
It would have been, and that's why it's a sitcom. And that's the other thing, is that you took a very serious, dramatic film and turned it into a comedy. It was that maybe is also what fell flat. Meaning, like, you have. I guess part of it was that you didn't have DVDs, you didn't have streaming or VHS tapes. It's not like people could watch this movie whenever they wanted. It's whenever it happened to be shown on TV. And so therefore, they could just make this goofy sitcom with a theme song, Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. And it's just like, what it does. It's so incongruent. I think if it existed on its own without the shadow of the film, I don't think it would have been that well remembered either, but it would have been maybe something that might have had a little bit more staying power. The fascinating thing to me was how Kennedy was a character in this film, meaning he was the president at the time, and even though they don't show him, but you hear a voice of someone imitating Kennedy, and even though they don't mention Kennedy by name, they make a statement at one point, because this particular episode, Smith, he wants to go eat lunch. He goes to this fancy restaurant, and they were like, "Oh, we'll sit you." And he said, "Well, I don't want to go in front of other people." He said, "Well, they all want big tables. There's a little table there. You could sit there." And they're like, "What do you want to eat? We have all this fancy food." And he's like, "I just want a peanut butter sandwich." And they're like, "We don't have that on the menu, but we'll make it for you, Mr. Senator." And they're like, "But do you mind if this other fellow sits with you?" He's like, "No, go ahead." So this Frenchman comes in, doesn't speak any English. The Frenchman indicates the waiter, who understands enough French, he wants a real American food. So he asks Smith, who's a real American, what should he eat? He said, "Well, he should have chili." He says, "Well, what's that?" He's like, "Beans." He's like, "How do you say, legume?" "Oh, legume, oui. So he serves it, and he can't stand, it's a kind of slapstick thing that it's too spicy. He can't stand it. So he's drinking the wine, and he's drinking milk, and he's trying to get rid of it. So the Frenchman winds up eating the sandwich. Meanwhile, the paparazzi around see that Smith is sitting with this famous concert pianist, Pierre Lefranc, something like that. So then he gets a call from Mrs. Kennedy, from Jackie Kennedy, saying, we want this Pierre Lafrance to come play in the White House. So he said, well, he hangs up the phone. He's like, I don't even know Pierre Lafrance. Who is he? And then his wife said, oh, he's a great concert pianist. And then he says, part of the discussion though is like, what kind of food is going to be served there at this musical event? So he's like, oh, I'm sure there's going to be some stew. And he's like, and Smith's wife kind of looks like Mary Tyler Moore. I don't remember who was playing Smith's wife. She said, who is this? What do you mean stew? They're not going to serve stew at the White House. He said, sure, we got an Irish president. He's going to serve an Irish stew. He said, yeah, but his wife is French. She's going to be doing the cooking. It's not.
I see.
So then he shows up at this Lafrance at his hotel room, and before he gets there, Lafrance is talking. He's sitting there with Harpo Marx, and he's telling him, let's go to the nightclub and pick up some girls or whatever. So he leaves, and Marx is about to follow him, and Smith knocks on the door, thinking that Harpo Marx, who's playing himself, it's not that he's playing this character. At the end of the episode, it's clear this is Harpo Marx. He says, he's trying to say some words in French.
So in other words, the comedy is that somehow Fess Parker as Jefferson Smith is somehow, because of the sort of mistaken identity shtick, somehow thinks that Harpo is this great French concert pianist.
Yeah. So then he brings Harpo to the White House, and the actual pianist, he shows up because he read in the newspaper that he's supposed to be there. And he shows up and they're like, no, he's already inside. You're not him. They don't let him in. We don't find out what happens to him. And Marx does his whole shtick. First, he does
harp.
First, he does a funny piano routine and he pretends that he hurt his hand. And then he plays the harp. And then Kennedy, you don't see his face. It's kind of like Larry David playing George Steinbrenner. He turns to Smith and he's like, it's so great that you got Harpo Marx to come do this. This is a real great American
right. Maybe they should have served some gefilte fish and kugel, because you had a Jewish guy there, Harpo Marx. So you have to have everything there. Obviously, Harpo doesn't talk in the film and in the show because he never talked. He was able to keep his film identity inviolate. So it sounds like a pretty funny show, but for some reason it doesn't. You felt that it didn't go too many places. I would say from the way you're describing it, it's interesting because, there was this wave of hope when Kennedy became president. I mentioned before that there was a desire to go back to good old American values because people were scared about things in the Eisenhower years. There was a sense that maybe Kennedy could make things right. There was something about how photogenic he was, how glamorous Jackie O was, that somehow everybody wanted a little piece of him, and then maybe the world could be better. And maybe that's part of what they thought, that there was an interest in politics. What seems to me to be the major difference, other than Jimmy Stewart, is that Mr. Smith Goes to Washington is an indictment on politics. And it sounds like this is mildly making fun of politics, but actually, in a way, appreciating the politicians. It isn't like, House of Cards or these programs that we have today where everybody is trying to backstab everyone else. There's a sense that we live in a great country and we're being led by this wonderfully movie star-like president who interacts with everyone. And again, part of the power of why Mr. Smith Goes to Washington is that power is always corrupting, and there's always these money people behind it. And this sitcom didn't want to go that far. It just wanted to take a sort of a hick out of water and make him just not understand what was going on in Washington. Although Washington itself
it seemed like he understood well enough, but he was just kind of he didn't care. He just wanted to do his own thing, and he wasn't going to get involved with he's not being played as a dummy. It shows that he knows enough basic French that he can try to to say, a few words here and there. With,
so I guess the producers really had a hard time articulating what they wanted this to be, and maybe that's part of the reason it failed. Look, I think part of, again, we have to go back to the Fess Parker persona. I think, part of it is that once you get pigeonholed as a certain character, people don't want to see you in another garb. And I think that really explains why 2 years later, NBC, our mutual friend Tom Shabilla informed me that NBC for years was trying to get the rights from Disney to create a Davy Crockett program, because they figured, he's still so popular. Let us do it if you don't want to do it. And Disney refused. So what NBC did was they could get a hold of Fess Parker, and they went and they discovered someone who had lived also from Tennessee, from a little bit of an earlier era, a little more in the Revolutionary era, which was Daniel Boone. And Daniel Boone also was a great frontiersman. They were able to create pretty much the same character. They had to set it in a different historical era, the Revolutionary era, instead of the era of Andrew Jackson in the beginning of the 19th century. But as Tom said to me, they wanted him to have a coonskin cap. They wanted him to have the buckskins. So basically, this was their way, and Fess Parker could do Davy Crockett again, but call himself Daniel Boone. And both of these programs had, interestingly enough, they had top 40 singles. This was a period that, of course, the Beatles and the Stones, and even in the 50s, when Davy Crockett's song was hitting the top of the charts, this was the time you had Buddy Holly and Elvis and many of the other beginnings of rock and roll. But still, both of these Davy Crockett movies and mini movies, so to speak, and the Daniel Boone television series, they both featured this song that was on everybody's lips. When I was growing up, I knew the Daniel Boone song by heart, and I hadn't seen one episode of it. I was 5 years old, and everybody was singing, Daniel Boone was a big man, and he fought for America to make all America free. From the coonskin cap on the top of his head to the heel of his rawhide shoes, the rippingest, valiantest, fightingest man the frontier ever knew. I never saw one episode, but I knew the song, and I could still sing it from 55 years ago.
I mean, even 30, 40 years later, growing up, I knew Davy Crockett,
King of the Wild Frontier, right? But did you know Daniel Boone? You did not.
I did not know the Daniel Boone song. No, I think I might have heard it, but we knew the Davy Crockett song, and obviously Mickey Katz made David Crockett. It was popular enough to have a Yiddish style,
a Yiddish lampoon of it. Well, yeah. Look, Fess Parker got out of the business. He was 49. He made I think he made some sort of TV movie in 1973, or he was in some film, and then decided to hang up the buckskins. And he became a very successful winemaker. He actually wanted to produce. Open a theme park. He was very inspired by Uncle Walt. He wanted to open up a theme park, and he figured he could still do it because, as much as Walt Disney owned the films that they had made about Davy Crockett, they did not own Davy Crockett as a person. But I think that part of what, like I said, America was looking for, and that's part of what made him a star. I would say also in this same way, Andy Griffith, who sort of becomes a star pretty much at the same time. In the mid to late 50s, Andy Griffith does some television. Of course, he did the teleplay No Time for Sergeants, later made into a movie. That's also, by the way, an example of a television series that didn't go too far, No Time for Sergeants. And I think in sort of what America was looking for was pretty much something similar. Somebody who, in his homespun Southern wisdom, was able to cut through the chase. Here's your answers. It doesn't come from necessarily the Werner von Braun sort of intellectuals. It doesn't come from the psychological takes on things. It comes from the good old American common sense that's rooted in the people who founded America, and in many ways the Southerners. So I think, when you compare the two, I think it's very similar. Again, Andy Griffith, I think, as an actor, as he showed in his film that he made, A Face in the Crowd, Eli Kazan's film that has Andy Griffith. It's really powerful. And if you see it, it's hard to watch the Andy Griffith Show because he is such a despicable character, so duplicitous and so aggressive, obviously not being teiche kibara, as we say. But eventually, of course, what America wanted was Andy Taylor. They wanted somebody who, it's true, there were enough, of these other people around him in Mayberry, these other sort of ineffectual type of semi-Southern types. Again, only you have to realize, and this is part of my problem with Mayberry, is that although it's set in the South in North Carolina, hardly anybody speaks like a real Southerner, except Andy himself. Don Knotts, who, of course, again, was able to really invent that character and turn it into constant Emmys that he won playing Barney Fife. He's sort of like he's not from New York, but he's not from North Carolina either. But still, Don Knotts makes the show work in terms of the comedic engine. But still, the Andy Griffith Show relied almost completely on Andy, in a way, solving things. He might have to struggle somewhat to come to that wisdom, but we expect him to have it. Sometimes it's at the expense of Barney, and sometimes, Barney helps Andy discover it. But I think part of that is what we see, fascination with Fess Parker as well. Somehow these good old Americans know the answers. It's not the complex world that we think it is. That was what audiences, I think, were satisfied with. They wanted more. And that's why you have, I think, in the beginning of the 60s, you have these programs that extol, these Southern virtues. Well, it's true. Edgar Buchanan at the Shady Rest Hotel, Petticoat Junction, isn't exactly Andy Taylor, but still there's something about B. Bernadette and the others who are part of the people at the Shady Rest, which is also some little hotel in the South that somehow these ideals and these ways, these conventions are somehow more affirming. You can make a sitcom out of it because in a way they're funny, but at the end, they represent a better version of America.
Well, both of those shows are both Andy Griffith and Petticoat Junction have a certain air of seriousness to them. Maybe Andy Griffith a little bit more, although certainly B. Bernadette's character is a very serious character, as opposed to, the adjacent, Green Acres much more.
No, Green Acres, again, Green Acres was meant to sort of like to take that table that was being set by Andy and Petticoat Junction and to basically flip it on its head. Green Acres is absurdist. Green Acres deserves its.
Beverly Hillbillies in the opposite direction, meaning.
Right. I want to think of the Beverly Hillbillies and the Green Acres are very different. Again, Buddy Ebsen, who I mentioned before, who really had a resurgence in his career when he was in Davy Crockett, was then posed to actually, have his roles, a couple of roles in Twilight Zone, and then be pegged as the star of the Beverly Hillbillies. Buddy Ebsen's character, and I would say even you can take Granny and Jethro and Ellie Mae, they are really the better people in the city. Yes, sure. They are confused. They don't know what a swimming pool is. They don't know what a pool table is, but they don't need to know that. The people that are really, in a way, look down upon, the people that exhibit the bad meadows, so to speak, the people that play the heavies, the people are Mr. Drysdale, who's money hungry, Mrs. Drysdale, who's completely superficial. Jane, Miss Jane has a little bit of a positivity. She at least has some idealism. Nancy Culp, who plays Miss Jane, really a wonderful comedic performance there. But really the Hillbillies, although they aren't looked at like the Hillbillies of the 30s and 40s as just one level above swine, they, in a certain way, have homespun wisdom. Jed Clampett dishes out homespun wisdom to simple-minded Jethro. And Jethro really represents in the program not being caught up in that glitter and how perhaps being warned against that. When Jethro wears his jeans with a rope instead of a belt, he's a better person than when he's trying to imitate the various movie stars that are all around. And Ellie Mae's pristine beauty and sense is really based on the fact that she refuses to become your typical blonde movie star. And I think, which in a way is once again extolling the virtues of the South, the virtues of this old life that perhaps, yes, it's funny because they're fishes. They're definitely fish out of water. And
that goes back around to this Mr. Smith character that, he's the fish out of water. He's the country boy who's in the big city, and
I think the difference is
than the people around him.
Part of the reason why Beverly Hillbillies could work is because they were willing to, go for very broad laughs while retaining that essential fish out of water. The fish out of water really knows better. So you could go for these great laughs and these ridiculous things where, Granny has never seen a kangaroo before and she thinks it's some sort of jackrabbit that she wants to make stew out of, right? And all of that, it could be done. And people gobbled it up. And it was, in terms of the Nielsen ratings, these programs were in the top. The Green Acres, on the other hand, I think was a show that sort of like was scratching its head and sort of poking fun at these characters and really in a way lending itself, to absurdism, whether it's Eddie Albert or Ava Gabor. I think this is really shown by the Mr. Drucker character, who in Petticoat Junction, he's in
all three of them. He's in Green Acres. He's in Beverly Hillbillies.
He was only in the crossover. It was only where they did a crossover on the Beverly. The Beverly Hillbillies did a crossover with Petticoat Junction. And again, part of it was to inject something into the Petticoat Junction's ratings. And they show up as well. The Oliver and Lisa Douglas show up in that episode too, as sort of a cameo at the end. The Green Acres really cannot be really put onto those other two. But I think my point is the Frank Cady character, he is a different persona in Petticoat Junction than he is in Green Acres. In Green Acres, his ridiculous quotient is through the roof. He doesn't speak the same language they do. In Petticoat Junction, he's just, he's part of he's the single guy who owns the general store. Maybe we can find him a wife or maybe something else going on. The fact was, I'm happy Frank Cady they were able to give him some roles to play, but I think the difference in his roles is the indicator. You weren't going to have Arnold Ziffel watching TV in Petticoat Junction. It was a place for Americans to feel comfortable at. They were going to take that, they were going to ride that train that's going down the tracks, and they were going to stop there, and they would just say, "Oh, this is a nice place to be. I like this Hooterville. I like this spot. I like going to get a haircut from Floyd the barber. I'd like to be able to knock on the policeman's door and be able to catch a schmooze." And the worst drunk in the world locks himself up every single night. Like, that's a world to sort of love to be part of, as opposed to, the worlds, when all those shows were canceled and they gave us, All in the Family and all these programs that really, threw the careening big world at us, that world that I think, really spelled the end, Fess Parker's and Andy Taylor's. You're right. He recreates himself as Matlock and Andy Griffith still has a career, but I think that cradle, that cocoon, that sense of safety that those characters brought them, I think those were lost. So that's about it, my friends. Watch your step on the way out. We'll catch you next time. Take care. Thanks for joining us for another episode from the Yeshiva of Newark at IDT Podcast. Be sure to subscribe on your favorite podcast app so you don't miss a single episode.